people will see you better. And I also. So Shomidata will begin with, I think, more touching on the climate topics and covering also the issue of people's science. And I think this is very timely debate that we are having, that the IPCC reports, the latest assessment has been there, declaring that the science is firmer than ever before, that there's no doubt, and also giving some very important policy advice. For example, how much of the fossil fuels that are there should be left underground to prevent the dangerous climate change. But at the same time, the policy response is really weak. We have behind us the Lima Conference of Parties, where the governments, I think, repeated what I call the Copenhagen consensus of not doing anything meaningful. So the commitment is something like maximum +2 degrees increase, but the path, including the climate action, so far planned or committed, means something like +3, +4, maybe even +5. So we might have the latest. So there's really need for debate, the need for action. So we have the floor, Somi.
Thank you, Marco. And should we continue in English or?
English.
Okay, good morning. Good afternoon. We generally start in the morning, afternoon session. The title of this short presentation has been kept at Cochabamba to Paris. But I think without mentioning at least what was just before Cochabamba, why Cochabamba was needed. Cochabamba means, most people know Cochabamba for the water movement that people there in Bolivia originated. But in this context, in the context of climate change negotiations and people's actions, we are talking more about the Cochabamba People's Conference on Climate Change that was in April 2010, that some of us were able to attend. I think we should go back a little bit and see how things have changed from just before Cochabamba. Because from the time the climate negotiations started, there are two things. All of you know that UNFCCC and IPCC. IPCC is a little ahead of UNFCCC. But this year's the UN negotiation, the UNFCCC, UN framework, United Nations framework on climate change, that was the 20th conference of parties. Of course, many groups, many people's groups, many movements are calling it Conference of Polluters. It remains the same COP. It's actually become Conference of Polluters. For understanding what has happened and what is happening, we have to go back a little bit for a very brief introduction and then come to what happened why Cochabamba was needed, what happened in Cochabamba, what happened afterwards, what happened till now in Lima, which ended in December 12th, and on that basis, what we can expect in Paris next year, which is being built up or hyped up now as we are giving a treaty. This year, sorry. We are still in the 2014 frame, so Paris in December this year. Actually, if you look at the 20 years of global climate negotiations, in the initial years, there was an acknowledgement that this is a critical problem, and the polluters, at that point of time, if you recollect, that the first treaty, which is Kyoto, happened in Japan in 1997. So at that point of time, there are two differences from what is happening now. One, in this case, when we are talking about polluters, there are two things to remember. One is we are talking about countries. We are not talking about individual industries or regions or communities or societies. We are talking about countries. There is a fundamental problem in that approach, but that we will come to a little later. And second thing is, in 97, there was a very clear differentiation. The rich countries are the major polluters, which is called developed countries, and the developing countries and the poor countries were not major polluters, which was very true at that point of time. So when the first binding climate treaty, global climate treaty, was arrived at in Kyoto, people means they are the parties of the UNFCCC, which are I think now 194 or 195 nations. So they agreed that the Annex 1 countries, the more polluting countries, which both historically and at that point of time, annual emission and historical emission, by these two counts, they were the major polluters. So they were put in the first annexure, annexure number 1, and the rest were non-annexion countries. So the treaty was, as all of you know, and I am giving this reference because it's important to differentiate between 97 and what is happening in the last 3-4 years. So everybody agreed, the 190 plus parties, that the polluting countries, the Annex 1 countries, they will reduce their emission, and the first period of reduction was kept from 2008 to 2012, and the emission reductions were very little, but with the idea that in the next period this will increase. The emission reductions were something from 5.2 to 8.2% from then 1990 baseline emissions. I think I will not go into details of that negotiation because Ajay will touch on the negotiation, but to understand the science also, the science and what the non-parties did, non-parties in this sense, in the sense that in the UNFCCC framework, parties are only the country governments, the national governments, and there are a lot of other so-called stakeholders like civil society groups, movements, people's movements, many other groups. So these are, in UN parlance, they are observers or non-parties. So what they did, why these needs were failed, that to understand that we need to go sometime differ a little bit what happened or what didn't happen. So 97 was reasonably clear after a lot of negotiations. It happened that okay, the 37 countries will reduce their emissions very little fast, but they will keep on increasing their actual emission following the 2012 first commitment period. And the idea was that slowly the reduction means reduction in total greenhouse gas emissions, both carbon dioxide and the other 5 major greenhouse gases, which together are represented as carbon dioxide equivalent. So that was the understanding, and at that point of time, the understanding was, and the position also was, there are several groups of countries. First, let me talk about countries and then I will come back to the other parties or other interested stakeholders. Not in the sense parties in the UNFCCC parlance, but involved parties like many of us, many of our groups. So from Kyoto to what happened in Bali in 2007 is when this treaty was, we have to remember that though the treaty was called binding, legally binding treaty, there was no provision in that treaty that if a party which is committed to this treaty is not fulfilling its commitment, what will happen to that party? Nothing will happen. So though this was legally binding treaty, there was no provision for penalties, no penal provisions. So that was one aspect, but it was accepted as a reasonably good mechanism. But other thing that was clear in that, during the Kyoto negotiations, most countries talked about mitigation as mitigation. And mitigation, as we all know, that if my country is emitting say 2 gigatons of carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalent gases, mitigation means it has to be less than 2 gigaton next year, even less next year. So that's mitigation, that's reducing the problem. But in the Kyoto Protocol, that all of us know, but we must again point out, because what is happening now is somewhat a repeat of that Kyoto process in a more sort of looser version. Because when the US put a pressure on the negotiation that we cannot be a party to the Kyoto Protocol unless the flexible mechanisms are also including market-based mitigation mechanism. Markets do not reduce, but the market-based mechanism was if a country cannot reduce in its own geography, within its own geography, then is it possible that country will give some money to some other developing countries which is not part of the Annex 1, so which had no obligation to reduce in the Kyoto Protocol, because only the 37 countries had this obligation. So they can do something which will be reducing their notional, I am telling this because this is somewhat what we are coming to again in Paris. That's what the targets are. if that country, a country which is high polluter, which has an obligation to reduce, had an obligation under Kyoto, can give some money through the CDM or other mechanism, or even European trading, emission trading system, ETS, where a third world country or a poor country or an LDC or any other country out of these 37 countries will do something, like they will reduce their total emission from the projected emission, and that will be credited to the developed country which had an obligation but which didn't do mitigation in its own boundary, but they will get the credit for that mitigation. But that mitigation will be from a notional increase. That means, let me explain this, if not many of them, to many of you it will be clear, but maybe if one or two, three people it's not clear, that if the US has an emission of say 5 gigatons, and though US finally didn't sign the Kyoto Protocol, if they have to reduce by 1 gigaton, so they can do it within their country, or they can give India or China or Vietnam or any other country which is not the major emitter, not within the 37 country list, some money, and in one of these countries which is receiving this money, there will be some activity like planting a lot of trees. So that is supposed to soak up some carbon dioxide, or they will be putting a coal power plant which will be 3%, 4%, 5% more efficient than an older coal power plant. So that 3%, 4% reduction will be credited to the rich country, the next one country, which is giving this little bit of money. So that was the market mechanism which was included in the flexible mechanism. And unfortunately, the action following Kyoto in terms of mitigation, the major action actually happened in the market mechanism. Actual mitigation happened in few countries and few country blocks, like European Union. Actually, if you look into the emission scenario, the European Union's, including the expanded EU28 now, of course the earlier EU15, then expanded EU, now it is 28 countries. So the EU28 countries emission peaked in 1990. So they actually reduced their emission not entirely because of climate commitments, but there are different actions which were taken into their larger macro economies. The US actually kept on increasing. Most major economies, Canada, Australia, Italy, many economies even within EU, they also increased their emission. But within EU, some countries actually reduced their emission quite a lot. So that resulted in the European Union reducing its emission. So let us not go, I will not go into details of that period. Coming to Copenhagen in 2009, till a few months before Copenhagen, there are a lot of hopes amongst the global non-party stakeholder, and in this non-party means the parties of the governments, and also amongst a lot of poor country parties, like the least developed countries, like the island nations, like even the G77 plus China. There are some sincere, genuine hopes that in Copenhagen some agreement will be reached, which will lead to emission reductions, which will ensure that the temperature rise of the Earth's atmosphere, and this temperature rise, as probably all of us again know, the temperature rise is measured, both the temperature rise and the carbon dioxide concentration is measured on around 2 meters above ground level. It's not measured everywhere equally. Like the Antarctic, there is a huge gap, the Arctic, there is a huge gap, and there are other areas like in the Amazon. There are areas where these are not actually measured. That's why in many areas, in this temperature rise has actually gone much beyond what we call that the average temperature has risen from the pre-industrial area, on the pre-industrial age, by around 0.8 degrees Celsius. But there are areas in the north where the temperature has risen much beyond that. There are areas in the Indian Himalayas and the Nepalese Himalayas where the temperature rise has been recorded as 1.5 degrees Celsius. So even this goal, the global goal of keeping temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial time, saying that now we have reached 0.8 degrees Celsius, do not give the exact picture. So that has to be kept in mind. There are places where temperature rise of 1.5 degrees has already taken place. And why this sacrosanct goal of 2 degrees Celsius? because the IPCC studies, and IPCC again we must recollect that IPCC do not do its own fundamental research. It don't actually go into the science of it. What it does out of this several thousand scientists, 630 is the active group which works on the reports. What it does is look into published research in peer-reviewed journals. It do not do fundamental research of going into simulation and modeling. It looks into those research, collects the best science, and then it passes through a filtering process in IPCC. That's why when we accept IPCC reports as the scientific report is a little confusing, though we don't have anything better to go by, so we'll have to accept the IPCC report as the scientific report. But this goes to, I'm saying this because this is also important to build up our understanding. That after it goes through thousands of peer-reviewed research articles in climate change area on different aspects, on physical science, on impacts, on many of these, they actually have to pass through a filtering process. And in that, some non-scientific considerations also come in. Like it happened in the IPCC Assessment Report 4 in 2007, that some of the terminologies that the scientific report used had to be changed because the political bosses, they didn't actually accept those kind of terminologies because those were a little bit, they said alarmist, that you cannot use this kind of alarmist language. So some of the language, if you see IPCC AR 5, Assessment Report 5, the language is far gentler than even what was there in IPCC Report 4, Assessment Report 4. Though it says that unequivocally that the science is clear, the emissions are going up, the temperature is going up, but the language is softer. It's not very sharp. So that is another thing that happens in the what we accept to be scientific report. This is not, the final report is not purely scientific report. It passes through, I'm repeating this, passes through a political filtering process. So what is this 2 degrees Celsius? Because the IPCC has come to the conclusion that if the global atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration comes to or reaches 450 parts per million by volume, which was roughly around 280 before pre-industrial times, just before pre-industrial times, then the temperature will rise. There is a correlation. Temperature of the Earth's atmosphere will rise, and I am emphasizing this, Earth's atmosphere and the concentration in the atmosphere, because till now the other spheres, the hydrosphere, lithosphere, what happens to those spheres as a result of human carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emission has received much less attention. What has received most attention is what happens to the atmosphere and what happens to the atmospheric climate as a result of that. So that atmospheric temperature, which is again measured at around 2 meters above the ground, will reach 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial times, and pre-industrial times average annual global temperature was around 13.5 degrees Celsius. It seems very low because even now if within our homes, if it is like in my room, I keep watching, it's around 15, so we put a lot of sweaters, but that's average, including the poles, including the northern countries, winter, summer, everything. So that was roughly around 13.5, 13.55. Now it is 0.8 degrees Celsius more on the average, annual global average. But if it goes by 2 degrees beyond that, that is roughly 15.5, then the global climatic system will probably cross the tipping points. And what is this tipping points? Like the climate is as again maybe all of you know all this, climate is roughly, a climate of a particular place is roughly 30 years average of the weathers. Of a climate of a particular place of a particular season is roughly 30 years average, 30 years history and the average. But if any year of the consequent years, they go beyond the averages, that's called a change, because otherwise little bit of difference within the ranges is not called a climate change. Weather keeps changing, and that's one of the arguments that a lot of skeptics, climate skeptics, have used often without understanding that. So this was the understanding that if the global atmospheric concentration crosses 450 ppm, then the temperature will be 2 degrees Celsius, will cross 2 degrees Celsius plus from the pre-industrial time. That means global annual will be 15.5 and more. Then the climate system, basically the hydrosphere, the climate change of the climate system works, the maximum impact is seen through the hydrosphere or hydrological cycle. And that hydrological cycle includes the moisture in the air, the moisture that comes from the ocean, seas, rivers, everywhere, and the moisture in the soil, all this. Though we are impacting not directly the hydrosphere, we are impacting the carbon cycle, because by adding carbon dioxide along with other greenhouse gases, but carbon dioxide is the major pollutant, we are actually impacting the carbon cycle. The major amount of impact comes to the hydrological cycle. Excess rain, drought, drying up or glacial melting or drying up of soil. So all this happens mostly through the hydrological cycle, but also increasingly through other cycles now, like the Siberian and the northern frozen methane belt, permafrost belt in Siberia, in northern Canada. Now this has started releasing methane in increasing amount because the temperature has gone up. That's not the hydrological cycle, but most impacts that we see will be through the hydrological cycle. That is, as I said, excess rains, floods, droughts, glacial melting, rivers drying or river putting more water. So this was the position till about Copenhagen in 2009. And the Kyoto Protocol, whatever its flaws were, that it happened with the market mechanism as a major mechanism. It was not really a legally binding treaty, because there was no penal mechanism, though it was a legally binding treaty, called a legally binding treaty. But Kyoto Protocol had some good features, like it talked about the common but differentiated responsibilities with respective capabilities for countries. That means those countries which emitted more will be responsible more, and those countries which have more capability, because the understanding was by emitting carbon dioxide, by burning fossil fuels, they have built up their economies, they have become rich, they have built up their infrastructure. So apart from their historical responsibility of emission, they also have more capability to act at the present moment, which the poorer countries don't have. Apart from the fact that poorer countries have not emitted as much, or emitted very little. What changed after that? Two things very clearly. I'll go in this field very quickly. One is, from 2009, in Copenhagen climate negotiations, as all of you know, basically the idea of historical responsibility and the common but differentiated responsibility with respective capabilities was in effect thrown out of the window. Because in Copenhagen, there are two things. This is one, because in Copenhagen it was decided that no, every country now, because what was the change in the physical sense? In the physical sense, from 97 to 2009, in these 12 years, many developing countries, which are called emerging economies, they became reasonably big polluters in terms of greenhouse gases, which was not true in 97, which became the fact in 2009. China, India, Brazil, even Mexico, Argentina, Indonesia, these became major polluters in absolute terms. Though their historical emission was low, the current emissions, yearly, annual emissions, were comparable or some cases higher than many major European economies, like UK, France, Italy. So the chorus was, these are major polluters, now everybody has to join in contributing to mitigation. That means reducing the emission. So that was one change on the physical sense. The other change, as I said, was in the ideology, that the historically major emitters will have to take much more responsibility. That was effectively, I am saying effectively because the agreement which came afterwards came the next year in Cancun, but the groundwork was prepared in Copenhagen in 2009. That everybody has to contribute, it is everybody's responsibility. That was the major cause. And at that point of time, the global civil society, which is the non-parties in the UNFCCC framework, because as I said, parties are the governments, the national governments, which signed on to the UNFCCC convention, and there are others which had signed on to the Kyoto Protocol. which was excluding US, Australia. Of course, Australia joined afterwards, but then several countries like Russia, Canada, Japan, they went out of Kyoto afterwards. That's another story. But this change, these two changes, one, the idea that those who have contributed to creating this problem will have to take the major responsibility, in effect was thrown out. Second, since the many major developing countries became major emitters, major polluters, this chorus increased that they had to take major responsibilities. In Cancun, the next year, this got enshrined in the document. Ajay will talk about that, the Cancun Agreement and the pledge and review system. This is one major change in terms of science. Till Copenhagen, because I am talking about the science and the people's movement, till Copenhagen in 2009, the general agreement, whoever has done or not done whatever, that's besides that, the general agreement was that the requirement for emission reduction will be determined by the science. And by the science means by the IPCC reports. Because by that time, by 2009, there are already a lot of science which emerged that this 2 degrees Celsius goal is not good enough. In fact, 1.5 degrees Celsius goal with 350 parts per million by volume as atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration was shown by many good quality science and scientists and many research papers to be a safe level for the global climate. But since the IPCC agreement, IPCC consensus was on 450 parts per million and 2 degrees Celsius, the official negotiations, they stuck to 2 degrees Celsius and 450 ppm. And any action on the government fronts, they always revolved, or I should not say action, any plan or any wish on the government front, they always revolved around the IPCC's 450 ppm and 2 degrees Celsius. What happened in 2010? 2010 in December, the Cancun conference took place, which is the official UNFCCC conference of parties. But before that, seeing what happened in Copenhagen in 2009 December, some countries, particularly Bolivia and some other Latin American countries, there was a grouping called ALBA. Mostly ALBA was in Latin American countries grouping, and the LDCs and at that point AOSIS, the island nations grouping, they all decided, and Bolivia took the lead. In Cochabamba, they called up World People's Conference on Climate Change and Rights of Mother Earth. So from the civil society groups, from the non-parties to the UNFCCC convention, everyone else, except again, I should mention this, except the business lobbies. Because by Copenhagen, it became very clear that apart from the country governments, which are the parties, the business interest had a very large say in the negotiations. Though they are not party to the UNFCCC, they cannot be party, but many of the country governments were actually listening more to the business groups. And from that point onward, this bingo, the business and industry NGOs became very prominent. So along with the NGOs, environmental NGOs, etc., the bingos started playing a very critical role, very prominent role. And that role was, they didn't say climate change is not happening, unlike some climate deniers. They said it's happening and we have the solutions. So we can sell you the solutions. Later science has shown clearly, I'm jumping a little bit, later science has shown clearly that actually 70% plus of the global emission is coming from 1070 corporate entities. Just about 1070 corporate entities. So the argument that tackling climate change, mitigation, that means reduction of the emission, is very complicated because there are so many countries, is really not true. If you have just 1070 corporate entities producing more than 70% of the global emission, is it impossible for governments together to put some kind of control over these just 1070 corporations? Governments always bring out some kind of norms, rules, regulations. So regulatory framework was not very difficult to imagine, but the regulatory framework to control these emissions never emerged, because as I said, the bingos by that time, by 2009 and 10, the business and industry NGOs and those lobbies became far more powerful over national governments and their agendas than many other non-party stakeholders like civil societies, movements, many of them. What happened in Cochabamba? Large number of people, by some estimates close to 28,000 people gathered. This was without the UNFCCC, without the UN official participation. Some 34 governments took part, and they worked out, all of us were part, many of us were part of that. In 18 working groups, there were very thorough work on what need to be done, including what needs to be done in mitigation, what needs to be done in adaptation, along with the concept that when you do actions on either climate adaptation or mitigation, you have to respect human rights. You have to respect the indigenous people's rights. You have to respect the children's right. So this is one addition which the larger civil society and movement groups came out with in the Cochabamba Climate Conference. We don't have time to go into details of that. The other point, other important point that Cochabamba Climate Conference infused into the larger consciousness, which was always there in indigenous people's consciousness and their ways of life, is that human beings cannot claim everything on this earth. That this much of carbon dioxide pollution, this much of water. So how do we divide between Marco and Jayant Bandyopadhyay and Soumya and Ajay? It cannot be like that. There are a lot of non-human ecosystem, living systems on this earth. So this concept of rights of Mother Earth also is supporting a lot of other non-human life forms, including the vegetative world, including the other animals. So the primary requirement, the first requirement should be what the Earth's ecosystem, the living ecosystem require, and then only the human needs come in. So this is the second major contribution in a global scale which Cochabamba introduced in the larger consciousness, which, as I said, which always was there in the indigenous societies. They lived like that, which was not there in our normal negotiations. What happened after that, I'll quickly finish because I have 3-4 minutes, is that I'll give a little bit of figures. Today, the total greenhouse gas equivalent emission by some measures is around close to 56 gigatons. It might vary by 1 or 2 gigatons here and there. Whereas we need to, even by IPCC science, which is the consensus science, which is the governmental science, we need to reach a peak emission by, it was earlier called 2015, but now it is variously called that latest by 2020, the global emissions must peak and come down, and by 2020 it must reach at most 44 gigatons. So we have a huge gap already. And as of now, there is absolutely no possibility of either reaching, absolutely no possibility in terms of what is happening on the global scale, what the countries are doing, or what the countries have pledged. So there is absolutely no possibility of either reaching 44 gigaton by 2020, or, as all the science is showing, of remaining within 2 degrees Celsius by 2100, because the recent science has shown, in case of India, will cross 2 degrees Celsius before 2050. That's what the latest simulations are showing. In case of the world, by 2100, by the end of this century, we are likely to reach, and these are even the World Bank commissioned report turn down the heat in 2012 and 2013. If you see those reports, it's showing that the world will reach anywhere between 4.5 to 6 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures. And what will happen to the climate in those scenarios is very difficult to imagine, but you can do this exercise. There are, in NASA's websites, there are interesting simulations. When the Earth was when it was 3 degrees Celsius warmer than our pre-industrial temperature, this 13.5 global average, annual average, you can see the coastlines, you can see the Earth, and that geography we don't recognize. So many of these will happen, that's now assured. There is no, I don't think now there is any point of saying to keep within 2 degrees Celsius we should do this. We cannot do this anymore, because what has already happened by 2014, and in 2014 what Lima has done, this recent Lima conference, is again, Ajay will talk about this in detail I am sure, but it has again
institutionalized from a science-determined contribution what needs to be done. It has come to intended nationally determined contribution. First it was thought of nationally determined contribution. What nations will pledge, like pledge and review was basically nationally determined contribution. Because what happened in Cancun in 2010, every country thought, okay, I can reduce or we can reduce by this much. And that was their pledge, which was supposed to be reviewed. Now, you don't even have the NDC, you have INDCs, intended nationally determined contribution. The countries are determined, their contribution in reduction is this much, that is intended. You cannot hold them accountable to that. That's their intention. If they don't do that, that's fine with them. And the review process, whether there will be official review by UNFCCC and whether that will be reflecting, there will be any feedback collection mechanism, no. So this is where we have now reached, that from a science-dominated determination that this much reduction by this year, by 2020 we need to come down to 44 gigatons from today's anywhere near 56, 57, 58 gigatons. From to 2030 we need to come down to 35 gigatons. The atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide need to peak latest by 2020, anywhere before 2020. That's not going to happen because, as you know, the US-China deal and the biggest two polluters have clearly said, they have also clearly said, to hell with this multilateral negotiation. The big polluters, the big economic powers have every right to determine what they will do, to take decisions outside the UN framework, even if there is a UN framework on climate negotiation, which is the official negotiating forum. They can negotiate outside that in secret. This is another contribution of Copenhagen, because if you remember or you recollect, the UN process is a collective negotiation where even the smallest country has an equal voice. In Copenhagen, the green rooms were introduced. 20 economies got together in exclusion of the other 174. They decided on some kind of framework of agreement and they thrust it upon the rest. Many countries objected to that at that point of time, but by the time Cancun conference came, most of the countries actually signed on to that. Later on, the Cancun agreement and the Durban Platform on Enhanced Action, that the ADP, the Action on Durban Platform, is called Durban Platform on Enhanced Action or for Enhanced Action. All these actually were based on first this pledge and review. And the last comment that I want to make, because there are lots of figures and facts, we can have that in discussion, is that when we calculated, and a lot of people have done that, even the very loose, very totally inadequate Cancun agreement, which was the outcome of the Cancun negotiation in 2010, is in effect better than what has come out of Lima. In the Lima, where we have now come to the pledges, not pledges, the intended nationally determined contribution, INDCs. Now the Lima call for climate action says, we invite countries, mind this language, we invite countries to submit their INDCs, intended nationally determined contribution. These contributions are how much they will reduce their emissions. To submit by the first it was March, by the first half of 2015, if they are ready to do so. आप कुछ कीजिए, नहीं हम आपको इनवाइट करते हैं, आप कुछ करें, यदि आप तैयार है तो करें, ना है तो कुछ मत करें, ठीक है, वो भी ठीक है. So this is the language that we have come down to, and that's what I said. Even in Cancun, where lot of people, lot of civil society groups have severely criticized the Cancun agreement, the inadequacy of the Durban Platform on Enhanced Action. These are all nice sounding words they pick up. Durban Platform on Enhanced Action. So when you listen to that, you will find that okay, countries are really not only doing action, taking action, they are enhancing their action. Actually, that was a dilution of action. And here, the Lima call for climate action that only invites the countries to submit, even if you are ready. If you are not ready, don't submit. So that's the kind of language. And surprisingly, at the end of the Lima conference, there was no clear negotiating text. We repeatedly went into the UNFCCC website. We found typical legalese language, and then at the end, a place where the actual text, actual negotiating text will be there. So even this text, I'm not going into the text because Ajay will come into the negotiating text, etc. But even these languages have deleted all commitments, all reference to any kind of commitment, to any kind of review, or any kind of sort of multilateral process. Though the UNFCCC still lives on. In my opinion, now it is time that you should write off. Do not have any hope on Paris, because there are two things which has happened in between. The UN Secretary General has called a one-day climate summit on September 23, where the market forces again prevailed. So they came out with two things. One is basically putting agriculture as a mitigation mechanism, which will have tremendous adverse impacts on the third world agriculture. The second agreement that they have arrived at, which will be probably institutionalized in Paris, is a sort of alliance for carbon pricing. And if this sounds good, there are one good element in carbon pricing. If there is a very clear progressive carbon tax, like France came up with some carbon tax. There was a proposal and it was started by you, but I don't know whether it has been withdrawn. A carbon tax on aviation. Any flight that goes into you or goes out of you, there was a carbon tax, because flying is one of the most carbon emission intensive activity. So whereas there are a few good positive actions, possible positive action on carbon pricing, like a progressive penalizing carbon tax, carbon pricing in general is very dangerous, because that gives a license to anyone, any corporate entity, anyone with little money to keep polluting and not do anything. Because I have paid my little carbon tax. Like in India, you have a 50 rupees cess on coal, per ton of coal. So you can mine and burn a ton of coal and pay 50 rupees. So that will be your price for putting the Earth's climate into disaster, in disastrous change. And that kind of carbon pricing, what we have heard is already there is an agreement that will be institutionalized Paris, and that will be tom-tommed, and there will be a lot of drumbeats that we have taken a great action. The Paris Climate Treaty will be great climate treaty, because carbon pricing probably will be launched in a global scale. Already many countries have launched. It started with EU. Many US states have done this. China has launched it. In a sense, India has launched the Renewable Energy Certificate, the PAT, the Perform Achieve Trade. These are basically carbon trading. Many countries have seen that their corporates are happy. The governments which gets money and their GDP growth dream can keep running in full steam. They are happy. Only unhappy part will be those like what happened in Uttarakhand, like what happened in Kashmir, what happened in Philippines. People in large number will be very unhappy, will be paying the price. But the corporates and the even most of the nations, today we don't see more than 4 or 5 countries which are strongly bringing this up, because even the most threatened island countries, even though they raise this, they are falling prey to little bit of bilateral financial aids. And so I just take 1 minute here, how this dilution has not only come into this mitigation aspect, because in Bali there was a framework evolved which was called the 4 pillars of climate action. One was mitigation, that is actual reduction of greenhouse gas emission. The other 3 were adaptation, what happens as an impact of climate change. People need to be helped in adapting to that. Third was technology, or it was called technology transfer, the technologies that you need for both mitigation and adaptation. Fourth was climate finance, to both do action on mitigation and adaptation and to energize technologies you need money. 2 more concepts on these have been added on, but the figures have been again diluted tremendously. The 2 more things that have been added on, because no mitigation, actual mitigation has taken place, very little adaptation has taken place, so the actual damages by climate catastrophe is increasing. So emerging from Cancun, there was now a thing called loss and damage. what is actually the loss and damage. Loss is basically non-tangible climate impacts, and the damages are actually what you can financialize, what you can convert to money. That is the damage. So loss and damage is one area which has been added into the fore, and the sixth one is capacity building. But if you look into this, how this has evolved, the island countries, least developed countries, the poorest and the most impacted, they have also digressed from their reasonably strong position before Copenhagen to a position, give us a little bit of money and we are happy. We won't talk about mitigation much. We are also happy with the INDCs. We are happy with no adaptation, no mitigation. And we are happy even if the World Bank has in 2007 has come out with a figure that the minimum amount of money that is required for climate mitigation and adaptation in 2007 was $500 billion per year, which was later revised to $600 billion. Now we are talking, and this is the official figure, $100 billion per year starting from 2020. Forget about inflation and deflation, inflation by depreciation of that money. What 100 billion in 2020 will be in comparison to 500 billion in 2007. Economists amongst you can probably calculate, but it might be less than 1/10. But even that is not on the table. Now we have come to around $10 billion for a 4-year period. So even climate finance is now peanuts. So you will not get mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, everything together will be within $10 billion. And one, to give a reference figure, one coal power plant in Madhya Pradesh, the Sashan, cost around $4.1 billion. Just one 4,000 megawatt coal power plant. So for the entire world, for all kinds of climate damages, now we have for 4 years $10 billion that has been pledged. So that's the great climate finance story. So nations are tom-tomming that also. We have achieved, the hyped Green Climate Fund has achieved this target by Lima, because they have got the capitalization of $10 billion for a period of 4 years. So that's the story of climate finance, which was supposed to be the fourth pillar evolved in Bali. So the scenario is very bleak in the official figures, but in the unofficial, outside the government parties, as I said, the business is gung-ho, because what we have achieved collectively till Lima is all the business as usual friendly. The business can keep on prospering. They have caused this crisis. Now they can sell the little bit of survival kits to whoever can pay. So that business will also be supporting, and this climate finance is also going to finance private parties, and supposedly some of this finance will come from private parties. So which was earlier targeted that it will all be public finance. Now a large part of this is supposedly from private finance. So the scenario is very bleak in the official negotiations, as well as for the people who are suffering. But what is happening in now, we are at a point when I say last point, when we say, I'm saying we, is beyond these governments, beyond the business as usual interests, is the civil society, the movements and the people who are suffering. Unfortunately, we are at a point of action which is at a lower level than when we were in Cochabamba. In Cochabamba, the action level and the interest level, enthusiasm level, both were higher. Only now, after seeing what happened in Lima, lot of groups, some groups started earlier, Reclaim Power movement, Demand Climate Justice, there are a lot of movements like this, but these are very limited. In Cochabamba, the global non-party, the non-nation framework thing had been mobilized. We don't see that kind of mobilization as yet from the civil society, from the movement grounds. The only change that we see now is on the microscopic scale, not on the macro scale. In many countries and many regions, there is now more active resistance to the activities that cause these emissions, like coal power plants, oil pipelines, many of these, the coal exporting ports, terminals, oil terminals, many of these are now, earlier there used to be petitions, there used to be advocacy. Now groups are resisting these on the ground. They are blockading terminals, they are trying to stop coal export, they are trying to in fact stop the construction of coal power plants. So that is a positive, because from petitioning and advocacy, a lot of groups have actually realized that this advocacy is not leading you anywhere. So the only alternative is action on the ground level. And then you talk to your governments, try to change policies, but you have seen what we have talked to our governments and tried to change. And over the last how much? The Modi government came in May and December, 7 months. In 7 months, a whole lot of regulatory framework, whole lot of environmental protection mechanisms have been broken down. So people who are clearer, they are seeing very clearly advocacy is leading you nowhere. The only alternative, as I said and I want to repeat, is action. And all the alternative fora, alternative congregations that are happening now, not at the scale of Cochabamba Climate Conference, but in a smaller scale, are now focusing on actual ground level action and how these actions can be linked together, and then put pressure on the governments by action, not by advocacy and petitions. So that's where I will end. I think there are a lot of things that I could not bring out, but if there is discussion afterwards, I think that will come.
Thank you, Soumya. I think we would move on directly to the second speaker and take the questions and comments together.
I think
So-
this has to be-